Are we recording, Joseph?
Yes, Stuart, it started recording. Please take it.
Okay. All right. Thank you. Okay. So this is a recording of some of the work we did for the T-Mobile wholesale proof of concept. This is the API testing side of the proof of concept. And what we're going to walk you through are some of the assets that we built for the REST API and SOAP API endpoints. So what you're looking at right now is the OneTest API IDE. This is where you develop your tests. And first of all, I'll just show you a couple of the key assets that we created. So we have a couple of database connections where we connect, for example, to your Samsung DB over here on EDB93. This is to allow us to get a SIM number that we're going to use in the test cases. So we've got a fresh SIM number every time we run through the automation. And likewise, we have a connection to your wholesale database, QTWHP1, so that we can validate the status of activations and deactivations and things like that, so we can automate some of the testing. Beyond that, we have your REST APIs that we've modeled here, and your SOAP APIs that we've modeled from the Swagger and from the WSDL. And we could have a look, for example, at what we model here as an operation activate subscriber v3, one of the services we're going to observe testing against. And you can see that we're going to run a post against the wholesale service with a particular SOAP action here. And you can see we've got the schema for this particular operation described here as well. This activate subscriber input with a sender ID and optional callback locations and so on and so forth. So this is setup that happens once only. However, you can come back and resynchronize this if there are any changes in the future. We've also got your endpoints. So where we need to physically send the network traffic. So in this case, local host, obviously that isn't the one we're using the secured one. So QAT03 is the environment we're using. We've got SSL enabled, and we're providing a certificate as a part of the key store that's set up on this connection. It's very similar for the REST endpoint. So let's have a look at the tests. So what we've done is we have modeled two scenarios, one for SOAP and one for REST. And if we, let's say, have a look at SOAP first, you can see the first thing we do is we go to the Samsung database and we get a valid SIM. And then we activate that SIM. We then replace products, add a product, query for subscriber usage, query for network information, and then do a subscriber inquiry. What you're looking at here is something called a test suite, and it's a sequential set of actions that will follow one after the next. And these building blocks are what we call a test. And so each of these represent a test script, which doesn't require any code. And each of these building blocks, each of these tests can pass data from one to the other. So in our case, if we have a look at our get valid SIM test against the Samsung database, what we're doing is we're querying the database to return us a serial number that we're going to store dynamically. And then we're going to pass that SIM number to the activate test. So we have this v3 activate test down here. So our activate test is going to send a request to our wholesale service endpoint to activate the SIM that we've just acknowledged. And what you'll see when we open up the configuration panel for this action is a tree. And this tree of data represents, in this case, the SOAP message, but when we look at the REST services, you'll see it as JSON. This represents the data that we need to use to activate. And obviously some of this is static and some of it is dynamic. So you see here the ICC ID value. We're taking that to be the serial number that we got in the previous step of the test from the Samsung database. And once we've sent that request, we will receive a synchronous response, and we'll validate that response to check that we get a successful status. So we're looking to see that we have a success. We're also going to look for the workflow ID, and we're going to store that workflow ID into a variable, into a parameter called workflow ID. And in order that we check to make sure that the activation has fully completed, we're going to go to the database, because when we receive this response back from the service to say the activation has been successful, that doesn't actually mean the activation is complete. It takes some time for that activation to process in the back end. So what we're doing here is we're running a database query into the wholesale database to look for results where the workflow ID is our workflow ID from the transaction we've just run, and checking that it equals success. So that means our test can then flow to the next stage, and we can add a product, safe in the knowledge, replace a product, safe in the knowledge that the SIM has already been activated. So let's run this SOAP scenario. You'll see we've moved into our test lab, and you can see the scenario has started. We've gone and we've got the first SIM, so you can see the output. We've got this new serial number 8901 ending in 976, and then the next stage of the test has started. So we've done the activation, and the activation completed, but it was then waiting, querying the database, looking for the status success for our workflow ID until it had completed. And then once that activation had completed, we do the same thing for replace products. And then we do the same thing for add products. So you can see already we've sent the request to add a product. We've already got a reply back. And then we're just waiting, polling on that database, looking for the status that we're expecting. And then on and on. So we do the add product, the subscriber usage, the network, and then the subscriber inquiry. And that's that scenario completed and finished, 100% passed and successful. If I wanted to go in and look at some of the data, so let's say in our activate test, if I wanted to go and look at the receive reply, the response to my reply, I can click on this hyperlink, and it will actually show me the data that I received. So I can see I got a 200 OK, and I can see down here in the message section, this is the content of the response that we received back. So with all the transaction date times and so on. Now we're validating this message, but there are some things that we have done to tune that validation, because clearly the transaction date time, the workflow ID, and many other fields within this message will be different every time you run it. So we've disabled validation for some fields, while we've left validation enabled for others. So if we look for the status, for example, you'll see we're validating success, but this grayed out value here for workflow ID and transaction date time, those are grayed out because we're ignoring those fields on a field by field basis. You can select that, and it doesn't require any code to achieve that. Now, if we jump over to our results gallery, you'll see from here, there is a report that you can access. You can select our SOAP scenario, and you can see that this is going to give us a summary of historic executions of this SOAP test. So if I were to go and look here in the instances, you can see at some point this morning, we did run this test, and we had expired all of the valid SIM numbers. So we did have a failure. So let's have a look at what a failure would look like. And I can see, you know, at 14:36 on today's date, we were able to get a valid SIM. And I can see, if I just scroll this up a little bit, I'm a bit limited on screen state here. I can see that our get valid SIM test passed, and that we did get a new serial number. But then when we did the activation, when we went through activate, this particular test failed. And it failed because when we got the reply, it didn't match our expectation. There were some different values. We expected a success, but we got a failure. And we can actually go to the console and see why that failure occurred. And we could click on here, and it would take us to that message difference window, and it will show us that reason for failure. So we could scroll down, and we can see failure, and we can just expand that whole part and see the exact reason for failure, which was there are no available MSISTNs for the NGP or zip code provided. So that's how a failure would represent itself in the reports. And these reports are not just visible from within the tool itself. You can also look at these reports in our web server through our dashboard. And if you link these tests into your pipelines, if you have a continuous integration, continuous deploy, or DevOps pipeline, all of these reports can be linked directly into that. So let's just go back and let's have a quick look at the other scenario that we automated, the REST scenario. Very similar in terms of how we've architected the test. There is a scenario within our test suite. There are several tests that correspond to the building blocks, what we want to do. So we will get a valid SIM. Because this is a REST API, we need to get a token in order to be able to query the API. So if we go and, where is it? There it is. It's a query test. We're going to have a quick look at the query here. You'll see we are sending, is this the right test? Yeah. No, I think we want the login, don't we? It's not query, the login test. Get auth token, here we go, sorry, I was showing the wrong test. So there's a test here to get a token, an auth token. So we send some headers with basic authorization, and we get back a response which will give us a resource value and a token type. We will then store that token that comes back from the authentication service. And then just like we did in the SOAP test, we will pass that token from our authentication test into our query, which will then use that authentication token as one of its properties. So here you can see we're passing in a bearer authorization token, and we're taking this ID token from the previous step, the previous building block. And the reason why we've built the test in this way is so that from a maintenance perspective, you know, if you needed to change the authentication mechanism, or if you needed to change the deactivation, you can do so in a single script, rather than building one long script that has all of these actions in, which you absolutely can do, but it's not recommended for the reasons I just outlined, for maintenance purposes, but also because you might want to build new scenarios and perform these actions in different orders, different sequences, and so on and so forth. And you can drag and drop these together to build the scripts as you wish. So with the REST API, we didn't go to the wholesale database. I don't think we can go to the wholesale database to check the actual activation or deactivation status. So in here, as another example of how you can do this, we've added a sleep step. So there is a 60-second sleep in there just to delay the next step of the test sequence, so that we know that the activation has actually happened. And you could tune this yourself, or you could, perhaps find a more intelligent way of checking that the activation has actually finished, has actually occurred. But for the purposes of the POC, we've shown you two different ways. So in the SOAP example, we've activated, and then we've gone and polled the database, waiting to check to make sure it's actually completed in the back end and committed to the database. In the REST API, we've just added a fairly dumb sleep. So you can see that the REST test is running. We got the SIM number. We got an authentication token from the authentication service. We ran a query to get some information about that particular SIM. Then we activated it, and now we're waiting for, I think we set 60 seconds as the delay. And then once the activation has completed, once the sleep has actioned, then we go and deactivate that SIM. And you can see, if we go and have a look at the response message, you can see we've got a status code 201 created, and we've got a success. In this case, we are using JSON objects rather than XML. But you see it's still represented as a tree. And you can see, again, we're still ignoring things like the MSISDN, the ICC ID number, simply for the sake of simplicity in the test script. We're just looking for the status success and the result string of 100. So we can see the deactivation completed. We can see we're just currently in, I think, the final sleep stage, waiting for that deactivation to complete. And then once that's done, we'll see the final step, which is the reactivate. So we've sent the reactivation request, we got the response back, and that's it. The test has now completed. So I think that concludes the demonstration. Thank you. If you want to stop the recording, Joseph.